Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Optimizing VDI with Core Tech Services. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items to address. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to you after the session. If you have any questions during the session, you can enter them in the question box, and we will answer them in the question and answer session at the end. My name is Hannah Westra, and joining me today are Cindy Menke and Brian Barnes. Thank you both for being with us today. At this time, I'm going to pass it over to Cindy.
Good afternoon, Hannah. Thank you very much. And Brian, thanks again for being here today. I know you're a very busy guy, and it's a lot to take this time out of your schedule, but you're also extremely knowledgeable, and you bring so much to the table. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So I think everyone knows that this is part three-part series. Part one, we talked about misconceptions of VDI, so we're going to quickly recap that. Part two, we talked about back to VDI basics, where we talked about some of the new technology stacks that make VDI so viable today. And then after those two quick recaps, we're going to get into the meat of today's discussion, which is optimizing VDI so that you can get to a full production rollout and realize the full benefits of it. So let's get started, Hannah. So part one, misconceptions of VDI. And again, these are recorded webinars. They're on our website. And so we're going to quickly go through these things. If you want all of the meat of that, you can go to our website and listen to the whole thing. So VDI, we've been doing VDI at Core Tech since 2005. Back when it was new, at that time, we had just come out of the server virtualization rush, and so it made sense that, oh gosh, server virtualization works so great, it must be great for desktop virtualization too. So a lot of people jumped in and then found out kind of quickly that it wasn't as easy as server virtualization, that it was more expensive than they anticipated, it was slow, it didn't scale. What we saw back then, and actually we still see a little bit today, is that people would get to about a 50-user pilot and then hit a wall because they didn't have the right architecture behind it to scale, and it was slow. Users didn't want it. All their applications didn't perform correctly. They didn't have personalization. All the desktops were the same. And it wasn't resilient or redundant. So there were security issues. There were, the data center went down, you lose your desktop, and so all of those things made it difficult to get to a full VDI production rollout. Unfortunately, a lot of people still think these things about VDI, and so much in technology has changed that make all of these things really a thing of the past, which kind of set the stage and brought us to the second webinar that we did, which is Back to VDI Basics, where we talked about all the new technologies on the scene today that kind of took all of those things off the table, all of those barriers to full VDI production rollout, took all those barriers away. One thing that has not changed, though, in the way that we approach VDI is to always start with a use case assessment. The criticality of that, of understanding an end user workflow and then building that VDI environment to specifically accommodate and support that end user workflow. And it's true today, Brian, that we can build a VDI environment that supports multiple use cases. It's not like a one size, I guess it is a one size fits all. You build a VDI environment and you can support a clinician workflow, you can support a remote user workflow, you can support the IT staff, the admin people in HR, like the radiology and tags that users move around the hospital, so that one VDI environment can, if it's built right, can support all those different workflows. And to be able to address that, you have to start with a very comprehensive use case assessment. So that hasn't changed. That was the same 10 years ago, 12 years ago, it's the same today. And then in part two, again, we talked about all the new technologies that took all those misconceptions off the table. So things like secure pull printing, hyper-converged platforms that make scaling so much easier, new and different ways of delivering applications through layering techniques and different delivery techniques, and then specific end user enhancements that we get from, I don't know, products like Avanti and whatever, so we get the personalization. So that regardless of what device you're on and what location, your icons are right where you left them, and your workflow is consistent, and that you have that consistent experience. So it was fun to go through that session last week, talk about all those new technologies, because they do bring so much to the table to make VDI a very viable platform. So let's get into, unless there's anything you want to add to that, Brian, we can get into what we want to talk about today, which is optimizing. Anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, part of the VDI back to basics and misconceptions are VDI isn't a one-size-fits-all, and really to adapt a project approach towards a successful implementation is really understanding what the user needs are and drilling back into the proper products that can enhance the solution, as well as to drive down the administrative tasks and the continuing complexities that pop up as you scale. So I think the first two series really, highlighted, how you would approach some of these projects and how to get off on the right foot with addressing some of the complicated user needs.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get into what we want to talk about today, which is optimizing VDI. So let's start with just a most basic question, Brian. What does it mean to optimize VDI?
Well, obviously, there's a lot of technical discussions when it comes to optimizing specific workload. Dependent upon VDI types, you can optimize the client OS on the physical endpoints to jump into the virtual environments the most efficiently. But obviously, when you kind of looking at VDI as a platform, you need to optimize the client OS that's virtualized. There's specific services that you turn off. There's other things you do from group policy to help automate specific user expectations of the solution. And looking at services and memory footprints of the specific workload that allow you to increase scale, so number of users per physical host. But when we talk about optimizing, it can happen in many different ways. Obviously, from a technical perspective, but really working towards user experience. And when we at CoreTech, when we think about optimizing VDI, we are much more focused on how the user's experience with VDI will make a project successful or leave kind of a project in the dust as shelfware, right? And during our early adoption and understanding of why clients struggled with VDI so much, is they were definitely architecting solutions based upon IT need and not towards customer expectations. And so when we think of the word optimize, we really think understanding the user needs first and foremost and driving towards the expectation around that. And then to add on to that, how we look at the different approaches, right? So when we think of how users and customers will look at their VMware environments or look at their Citrix products that they own, how do the professional services arm of each one of those vendors look at project success? And obviously, it's optimizing the specific products that they own from a VMware or Citrix perspective in the way that they see from a best practices implementation. Well, the way that CoreTech looks at these technologies, being somewhat technology agnostic, is bringing in the other complicated aspects of a project and application delivery and what technology works best and what delivery approach works best for optimizing that VDI approach for the specific user needs. And so when you look inside of healthcare on Cerner environments, whether it's remote hosted or locally hosted, when you're looking at the professional services arms of other EMR technologies that track into their professional services implementations, it really takes a vendor to look at the holistic approach of the user to understand what they need out of a VDI solution. Do you want to add anything there, Cindy?
No, that makes perfect sense. So from my experience too, it's the stakeholders. We have CIOs, CTOs who are staking their career on an all-encompassing project like this. And so it's critically important for these projects to be successful. And from what I've seen, to call a VDI project successful, we have to get the ROI out of it. A lot of these decisions to even do VDI in the first place are based on ROI calculations. Those ROI calculations, and again, we talked about that, I think, at length in one of the previous webinars. As a whole, we anywhere between 6 and 18 months, depending on if you're taking soft cost savings into account. To go forward with a big project like this that will hit every user in an organization are many times based on that ROI calculation.
Sure.
Is it viable to begin with? So when I'm working with stakeholders on a project like this, I'm keenly aware in helping them get to full production, because it's not until you get to full production that you realize the full benefit of that ROI that we laid out at the beginning of these projects. So let's talk next about what are the roadblocks to getting to full production.
Sure. So obviously, when you're looking at a project, both from a stakeholder perspective and from a technical director perspective, you're looking at choosing the right product. But above and beyond that is how you're adapting into what it takes to get a pilot successful inside your organization. Part of that approach is choosing product based upon the needs of an organization, but it's really about the services approach to that. And I think what we've seen over a course of time is there are generally good ways inside of healthcare workflows to kick off a project and to build, good practices like end user communication, IT support, and
Because they're missing applications, and they can't use the solution if a part of the workflow.
right.
To go in and out of a workflow just kills VDI.
Right. I think, part of the things that we struggle with the most are, and one of the most common questions asked during an early part of the VDI project inside of healthcare workflows is, what shared applications should I start to pilot with, right? And it really is, it takes an understanding of what specific areas you want to prove the technology out with. And I think it's not only understanding the workflows, but it's really understanding at the core of how these adapt over time, and then building up upon project success based upon some of those preconceived notions. So, if we, in the pilot, don't take advantage of application layering, what impact does down the road mean when we venture into that second or third or fourth use case? Is there considerable changes that have to be undergone inside of what we initially built, or do we have to alter our change of project scope based upon how these scale into the environment? So I think it's not only understanding the core technology, but it's understanding how these get rolled out, on a case-by-case basis. And really, to Cindy's point, it's understanding the very nuanced architectural approaches towards the application sets, or what make those successful or not.
Right. It kind of boils down to the application set, doesn't it? Because any user that's in that VDI world, they have to have all their applications available to them. So really keying in on the application set is key and critical. So we've seen a lot of approaches to rolling out VDI. Some of them include picking certain endpoints. So for example, a lot of VDI decisions are made on replacing the endpoint. They have sick clients, and so the thought process is, okay, in my first pass, I'll replace all of X model sick clients. And they're scattered throughout the entire organization. Talk about why that's such a bad approach, Brian.
Yeah.
We're laughing at each other.
Yeah.
We've been there.
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to the endpoint, obviously there's a plethora of ways to manage Windows OSs at the edge. And when you look at the current struggles of large healthcare, it's managing these disparate different platforms over time as part of an acquirement of a healthcare system, where you might have a very big footprint of product that you don't know how to manage, right? And you acquired a health system, and now you have to figure out how to best manage that environment. And so we really do kind of focus in on some of the early kind of decision points around thin clients or zero clients, of what type of technology you put in place to really kind of decrease costs but increase manageability. And so we've seen a big uptick in understanding when PC refresh cycles can be used with ways to change out the OS of that environment more towards a thin client type OS. So we think we've seen a lot of traction inside of that towards endpoints there.
Okay, got it. So I'll just add that our approach is, when we talk about this production pilot, choosing the right area of the hospital, the right floor, the right group of users, usually 50 to 100 users in a very contained environment, but it might go across several different use cases. So for example, the doctors, respiratory, dietitian, anyone who might come into a department, so that, and then what you do is you set up VDI endpoints in that department, in an entire department, and then any user that's going to come in and out of that department in a shift, to make sure that their workflows are accommodated within that department.
Right.
So that you're not putting a user in a situation where they're mixing workflows and mixing endpoints while you're trying to do a pilot to kick this thing off. That's probably the hardest part.
It is, and I think what we've seen over time, the best areas to kind of leverage for that early pilot is like a med surg or an ED, where the users don't do too much roaming, because I think being selective on the user types that you want to do to kick off technology kind of integration into a greenfield or a new environment is based upon what control you have over a project. So I think, looking at those specific areas where you might want to prove out a physician office, like an ambulatory site, or a med surg or an ED, where those users don't do too much roaming, is a good place to start. But as you start to understand the application footprint and space and how this would scale out, you're inevitably going to be coming back to integrating more applications into your system. And if you're looking at different VDI approaches, whether it's true native VDI with Windows 7 or Windows 10 versus maybe a Zen app or RDSH model where you're delivering applications and presented desktops in different ways, it becomes an administrative complexity on how you integrate apps across those different solution sets. It's time, it's materials, it's additional services. And I think that's where projects tend to start to stall, is how do we get into that next level? It's easy to spin up a few applications on a few VDI type of use cases, but it's really hard to continue to scale these environments to the point where it really means something to the organization as a whole.
So what's the answer to that?
Well, the answer is honestly is that project approach which we talked about earlier. It's picking a very common set of applications inside of your shared clinical space and proving out multiple workflows around that, right? So if we have a physician that might use a virtual desktop inside of their physician office, what does that workflow look like when they come to the acute floor? Is there specific changes that we need to make as IT on constraining what that user can and can't do when they're in front of a patient versus not? Maybe giving some more freedom to the user if they're working from home, where they might have different tasks that they need to account for versus what we want to control inside of the workflow inside the acute. So even though we're blending different type of technologies together to do that, it really comes down to creating a efficient workflow for the users that's most optimized for them.
Okay, got it. So I'll add my experience to this as well when it comes to the end user communication. There's nothing worse for a nurse, clinician, whatever, to show up at their shift and realize they haven't been properly trained, they have a new badge, they have to enroll, they don't know what that means.
Right.
It's frustrating. And we're talking about patient care here. We're talking about
right.
making things easier for a nurse to be able to administer meds and spend time with a patient. So end user communication, I would say, is almost as critical as all those technical decisions as well. We can't forget about the soft side of this and how it affects the end users when you give them a brand new desktop, a brand new way to access their data. So we have learned through experience how to do that well. So and it takes, usually, 8, 10, 12 weeks to build the environment and start that, the UAT testing and all of that. So while all that is going on, we have learned the best thing to do is find your champion users, find your complainers. Every environment has them, and get those people on board. Start a training program early before the solution is even getting ready to get rolled out. Get them involved in it, get them excited about that, about their new workflow. Show it to them. Stand up a demo or a POC environment where they can come in, touch it, feel it, tap a badge, ask questions, try out a workflow, because it gives them time to start internalizing what's about to happen to their workflow. And it makes it a whole lot easier for them to get on board when they do have it.
Yeah, and I would add, give those specific users somewhat of a feel of ownership, right? So if you involve them in processes like UAT or user acceptance testing, it gives them a voice in what they want inside the solution. So when you're hitting the floor with a new product from an IT delivery, aspect or perception, is that when it hits the floor, they feel like they've had a voice into that solution. So it gives them, somewhat of a champion or a feeling of, I was a part of this, to really build the adoption and momentum you need to carry the solution just beyond pilot.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other piece of that pilot equation is strong technical support while you're in that first 2-week pilot phase, so that as idiosyncrasies or little things come up that are not quite tweaked just right, that the end user doesn't just shut the whole solution down and say, well, it just doesn't work.
Right.
They're a part of it. They're a champion for the cause to see it through, and they're willing to work with you to tweak it to their perfected workflow.
Yeah, and I would add that, CoreTech, although we can provide turnkey project solutions, the most successful projects that we're a part of are the ones that are most involved by both from an IT organization, from the healthcare side, as well as the user base, right? So the more involvement we have from the PMs, the project stakeholders, the IT teams that need to be, more familiar or intimate with the solutions that we're implementing, as well as the workflows that we're doing from an end user perspective, those seem to be the most fluid and successful projects, I think, that we partake in. It's a shared ownership or a shared partnership for implementation.
Absolutely, I completely agree with that. Completely agree. So
next.
Yeah, next. So I think this is our last question, Brian. So what are the common user complaints? And I think we kind of touched on some of this a little bit. Most of it, if there are any common user complaints, it's that we find them during that pilot phase.
Mm-hmm.
So things like not all their applications are there.
Mm-hmm.
We missed an application somewhere. Or the performance. I would say performance is one of the, probably the number one things that we tweak when we're in pilot.
Yeah, and I think performance can sometimes be a misnomer. I think, is the virtual desktop environment performing like a physical endpoint did? Our hope is no, right? Because we're enhancing the solution based upon the workflows that we're trying to integrate, and not just by an at speed perspective. So when a user walks up to an endpoint that's currently locked from a security perspective, if they're used to, moving a mouse and entering their username and password and then doing multiple clicks inside of that specific workflow, our hope is that we're providing the same application speed, but we're enhancing the solution from a workflow perspective. So instead of entering those credentials, it's tapping a badge or coming back to an environment where a desktop might roam to the device in under 10 seconds. Or maybe it's, instead of specific Epic deployments, they tap a badge and there's no application launch. They just do a user context switch inside of hyperspace. Well, when we talk about VDI, that can feel and look a little different, but the hope is that we can give not only app speed and performance, but cut time away from the users doing menial tasks like password entries, username, getting back to their desktop by just tapping a badge and not interacting with the keyboard at all.
Absolutely. So we keep talking about optimizing the end user experience through all of this, but there's optimizing that's happening in the IT department as well. So for example, less FTEs required to manage the overall solution once it's in place. A more resilient desktop that doesn't go down like a PC does. It doesn't have to be patched, so therefore it's not taken offline, 20 hours a year for patching and updates and things like that. So again, we're tweaking it for that end user experience, but the benefits are felt through the IT department and by the stakeholders in that eventual ROI that is achieved also. Yeah,
and I would agree, and I'd like to add one thing that we've seen over time too, is as these VDI type of environments become more mature inside of an organization, whereas healthcare had a really bad practice of just throwing more devices at a problem, where you have a plethora of devices littering specific areas or nursing stations, that when the right workflow is integrated in the environment, we see a natural reduction of endpoints inside of specific areas with that lead to better ROI, less management from an IT perspective, but more efficiency when you talk about users interacting with the technology in more efficient, time-sensitive ways, and not having the aspects of like device ownership by user, which I think a lot of organizations struggle with over time.
Right. I think we actually did a study. I think in some places we've seen about a 30% reduction in the number of endpoints required because of the efficiency that VDI brings. So it's interesting to me that this paradoxical concept that through optimizing a VDI environment through technology, the benefits are felt at so many different levels, not just by the IT people and the technology staff of people.
Right.
The benefits are felt by the stakeholders and their ROI, and surely felt by the end users in a much better workflow. That in the clinical environment, that's what's so critical, because the whole point is to be able to give caregivers more time, take away that technology barrier, give them more time to spend with their patients and not have to think and be frustrated over the technology that's in front of them.
Totally agree.
So better patient care at the end of the day. So optimized VDI equals better patient care.
There you go.
It's all good. It's all good. And I think that takes us to the end, Hannah.
Yes, it does. So again, thank you for joining us for this 3-part series. The recording today will be available soon. At this time, we do want to invite you, the next step, if you're interested, is to schedule a roadmap session to help you with your VDI strategy. If you want to sign up for that, go ahead. You can email Cindy or Ryan. Their email addresses are posted here. At this time, we are going to open it up for question and answers. So if you have any questions, go ahead and pop them into the question box. We'll also be looking at the chat box as well. All right, well, we don't have any questions at this time, but again, if you think of any in the future, go ahead and reach out to Cindy or Brian. And again, this recording will be available shortly. Thank you so much for joining.